Hello, and welcome to the 10th class on David. Let's start with a quick review. Last time we looked at David and how he dealt with catastrophe. We can either respond to disasters with bitterness, or we're seeking God in prayer, worship, and in the counsel of godly people. We experience the goodness of God through others who've experienced the goodness of God themselves. And we share generously with others because God is generous with us. Now, how many of you are comfortable in a funeral home or a cemetery? Are you like our kids that when they were little, they would hold their breath as I drove by a cemetery? How many of you have grieved before? Maybe it was the death of a loved one, the loss of a dream, the pain of a difficult diagnosis, the breakup of a treasured relationship. As you think back, did you grieve well? How long did you stay present to the reality of the pain, or did you try to get over it as fast as possible? Our culture wants us to grieve as quickly as possible, preferably to avoid grief altogether. But loss is a normal part of life. The loss of childhood because kids grow up, the loss of innocence, the loss of a job, the loss of a sense of security, maybe even something like the loss of hair. David teaches us today how to deal honestly and prayerfully with loss and all the emotions that accompany it. We face a paradox in life. Victory is sweeter when we've experienced loss, and life is more precious if we come to terms with death. Let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. So Saul and his 3 sons died together that same day. Saul and Jonathan are dead. The path is now clear for David to take the throne, to finally fulfill his destiny, his call. What did he do when he heard that news? We read in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David mourned because he cared. He lamented because life matters. David faced loss, disappointment, and death, and didn't avoid it or deny it or shrug it off. David lived energetically and he lamented fiercely. He gave voice to all his emotions. He didn't stuff or swallow a single one. One reason I appreciate New Orleans funerals, beside the amazing music, is because people don't deny their feelings. Their emotions are abundant. People weep, wail, sing, laugh, shout. They're willing to give their total concentration to the fact of death. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan. How the mighty have fallen. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul. David laments over both Saul and Jonathan. Now we can understand lamenting his friend Jonathan, but Saul was David's enemy. Saul hated David, tried to kill him multiple times, cheated him, forced him to live in exile in the wilderness with a ragtag bunch of losers, instead of the palace where the appointed king should be living. How could David lament his enemy? Well, David could lament Saul because he didn't focus on what Saul had done, but on what God had done. Saul made David's life difficult, but David chose to let God deal with Saul's hatred. David refused to let Saul make his life small, because David allowed God to make his life large. I find it fascinating to see the contrast of people who have to face the murderer of their loved one in court. Some come to court obviously bitter, seeking revenge. They tend to look tired, worn, older. Others come with the goal of seeing God in the murderer, to see a human being forgiven by God and seek to forgive as well. They look free. Now, I'm not saying we don't need to deal with the consequences of sin, far from it, but grief that is healthy tends to find its way to forgiveness a little bit easier. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me, David writes. It's easy to understand David lamenting Jonathan. Their friendship brought out the best in each other, even when that friendship happened mostly while they were separated. Even apart, Jonathan's love penetrated David's soul, and David released that love in lament. It is so true that great sorrow is the result of great love. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. David mourns his best friend and his greatest enemy. They both are honored, both given equal consideration. It's easy to mourn for our friends, but can we mourn our enemies? Lament can be taught. In fact, David insists upon it. And he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament. The way we deal with loss shapes our families and our communities. Because loss is a part of our lives, we can learn how to deal with the pain resulting from hate and the pain resulting from love. We can learn how to deal with loss in a way that is gracious, healing, and even beautiful. On June 17th, 2015, a gunman opened fire at the end of a Bible study held at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, killing 9 people. Later that week, the relatives of those slain confronted the gunman in court. Those who spoke didn't turn to anger, but even as they described their pain, they were able to offer forgiveness. Nadine Collier, the daughter of 70-year-old victim Ethel Lance, said, "You took something very precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never, ever hold her again. But I forgive you and have mercy on your soul." When love is taken seriously, when truth is taken seriously, life is honored. People are given dignity. Learning to lament, learning to grieve well leads us into grace. The people who grieved the events at Mother Emanuel give us a lesson in good grief. They remind us that our loss isn't private. We read in Romans chapter 12, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn." We face loss in our homes and in hospital rooms, at work and in neighborhoods. The community that gathers around us brings strength and reminds us of the promise of the resurrection. That's why the COVID pandemic has been devastating, not just with the medical consequences, but because we can't gather together to grieve as we long to, as we need to. What do you think of David in grief? Do you feel sorry for him? Do you feel pity? Is he less in your eyes because of his grief? Or do you feel admiration, respect even? I would argue that healthy grief doesn't diminish us, but allows us to be fully human. Now, did you notice the repeated chorus in David's lament? We see it in verse 19, 25, and 27. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished." You may think ugly crying is exactly that, ugly, but it isn't. And lamenting isn't ugly either, especially when it is transformed into beautiful poetry. It's not that David feels less pain, but when he enters that pain fully, the pain and David are transformed. Our culture prefers denial and distraction when faced with pain. Talk to any addict, whether that's alcoholism or workaholism. You'll find that many are trying to numb themselves because they're struggling with loss, hurt, rejection, frustration, or not getting what they want. Failing to lament, to acknowledge and deal with the pain, is like trying to skip the hard parts of our stories, of our lives. It's like trying to go from the celebration of Palm Sunday to the celebration of Easter without dealing with the tears of Good Friday in between. David faced loss and death, and he prayed through them. Over half of the Psalms are laments, prayers decrying enemies, evil, suffering, disease, military problems, business failures, crop losses, persecutions, And death. Loss is a part of life, so healthy grief must be too. The Psalms can help us give voice to our tears. This incident is actually the pivot point in David's story. Saul's death opens up a new chapter in David's life. Lamech takes David from life to death and back to life. Some important takeaways for today. Life is more precious when we come to terms with death. Grief can be filled with healing, grace, and beauty. And healthy grief can lead to forgiveness. I'd encourage you to check out the discussion guide, which also includes study suggestions and other activities. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll learn about dealing with the knuckleheads in our lives. Until then, keep the faith.